The fog rolled down from the moor that morning like a house guest, with no intention of leaving, damp, persistent, and quietly malevolent. It had a queer smell to it too, Whimsy thought, faintly reminiscent of damp tweed and misremembered secrets. He was seated, legs artfully crossed and an eyebrow arched in clinical interest, at the breakfast table of Dower House, on the edge of Lesser Twing, a village so small that its scandal was usually confined to creamery gossip and the vicar's curious sermons on Leviticus. He had come ostensibly to visit his old friend Colonel Marchbanks, now semi-retired from the 10th Hussars and entirely retired from the effort of keeping an orderly sock drawer. "Beastly stuff, this marmalade," Marchbanks muttered, poking at the jar as though it might growl back. "Too much rind, not enough honesty." "It's a moral failing in preserves," Whimsy agreed lightly. "Though perhaps preferable to too much honesty in society. I find sincerity positively bruising before 10 o'clock. He was just about to quote a line from Marshall, one concerning treacherous friends and over-salted anchovies, when the telephone rang. Marchbanks grunted and shuffled off, and Whimsy sipped his coffee in the silence left behind. That was the moment the mist deepened outside the window. Not just mist now, but something with purpose. He watched it gather at the base of the garden hedge, like conspirators bent over an unspeakable plot. A moment later, Marchbanks returned, an unusually stiff expression on his ruddy face. "Peter, I say, do you remember old Horace Caulfield?" "Not intimately," Whimsy replied. "Wasn't he the chap with the thing about early Tudor embroidery and a tendency to overuse the subjunctive?" "That's him. Lives, or lived up at Brackendale Lodge. He's dead." "Dead?" Whimsy tilted his head as though testing the word for soundness. "Well, that's rather final of him. Carriage accident, improper digestion of tripe, an unfortunate duel with a hatpin." "None of that. Shot, they say, in his library, sometime last night." Whimsy blinked slowly. "Shot in the library?" he repeated. "Well, that's frightfully uncivilized. And here I thought he owned a first edition of Pharsalia. Do say it was spared." "The police are already there," Marchbanks added. "But the chief constable rang me because I'm a trustee of the Brackendale Historical Society and, well, he wants your opinion." "My opinion?" Whimsy brightened. "Upon a corpse? Delightful. So much more forgiving than the living. They never interrupt." He stood up in one liquid motion. "Let's toddle over, shall we?" "You'll come?" the Colonel asked, relieved. "My dear Marchbanks," Whimsy murmured, pulling on his gloves with ecclesiastical care. "When a man of letters is shot among his manuscripts and the marmalade's a disappointment, the day clearly demands salvation. Lead on." They stepped into the mist, which had thickened so that the path to Brackendale Lodge seemed drawn in pencil rather than paved in stone. The trees whispered damp warnings, and a rook called once overhead, startled perhaps by the sudden intrusion of death into its parochial woodland. Brackendale Lodge was a long, sullen house with Elizabethan bones and Edwardian additions, the sort of structure that looked perpetually undecided about its own purpose. Whimsy surveyed it as one might a poorly cast actor in a Greek tragedy. The police had already arrived, 2 constables, earnest and pink about the ears, and a detective inspector named Copley, who gave the distinct impression that he viewed anything unorthodox with the suspicion normally reserved for French cheeses and women in trousers. "Lord Whimsy?" said Copley, a touch stiffly. "Not quite standard procedure, calling in nobility before we've had the coroner, but, well, I was told you'd handled worse." "Somewhat worse," said Whimsy, adjusting his monocle and peering about. "Though never before with this much fog and quite so little coffee. Where's the deceased?" "In the library," Copley replied grimly. "Locked from the inside. We had to break the door." "Ah," Whimsy smiled faintly. A locked room scenario. I do so love a theatrical opening. As they stepped inside the lodge, Whimsy noticed the air still held the remnants of pipe smoke and ink, civilized scents, now strangely funereal. The rug in the hall bore a faint, damp footprint, though the tiles were dry. Whimsy looked at it with mild interest but said nothing. In the library, Horace Caulfield was slumped against a rosewood desk, a revolver near his right hand, and a widening stain upon the floor. A dark red punctuation mark to an unfinished sentence. The expression on his face was one of mild surprise, as though he'd been interrupted in the middle of something rather tedious. "There's no sign of struggle," Copley said. "Door was locked, windows latched from the inside. No signs of forced entry, nothing stolen." "Nothing stolen?" Whimsy echoed absently, running his hand along the edge of a bookshelf. "And yet so much lost." "Pardon?" "Merely pondering," Whimsy replied lightly. A man surrounded by books is rarely alone, but sometimes he is only among them, not of them. "Tell me, has anyone corrected his Latin lately?" Copley blinked. "What?" "I see I shall have to begin at the beginning," Whimsy said with cheerful resignation. "Tell me, who last saw the late Mr. Caulfield alive, and what were they doing with a silver salver full of cold beef at 10 minutes past 8? "How do you know about the cold beef?" "I don't," Whimsy said, smiling faintly. "But I suspect it will turn out to be relevant." And with that, Lord Peter Whimsy turned his full attention to the room, pausing to sniff a candlewick, tilt a portrait, and examine the disarray of a chessboard in the corner where the black king had been toppled and a pawn placed neatly in the dead centre of the board. He said nothing, but his eyes gleamed. Whimsy did not immediately approach the body. Instead, he moved with casual purpose toward the writing desk, running a gloved fingertip along the edge. The dust pattern was telling. An inkwell had been recently shifted and not returned quite to its original place. On the blotter, a corner of paper protruded, half tucked beneath the heavy ledger of Caulfield's catalogued collection. With a murmured apology to the deceased, Whimsy extracted the paper and studied it. It was a translation, Latin to English, of a passage from Seneca, and curiously it was wrong, not egregiously but subtly so. A misrendering of Ignavis semper feriae sunt, as the idle always seek rest, rather than the more accurate, for the lazy every day is a holiday. Whimsy's lips curled at the corner. "A scholar's vanity," he murmured, folding the paper and slipping it into his breast pocket. "A dangerous thing to die by." The housekeeper, Mrs. Wills, was summoned next, a skeletal woman with a disapproving mouth and a spine that seemed forged from piano wire. Her hands trembled, though whether from nerves or outrage at being roused before luncheon was unclear. "It was I who found him, my lord," she said. "This morning, just before 8. I brought his breakfast on the tray, always does like his kidney and toast early, Mr. Caulfield did, and found the door locked, no answer when I knocked. I called out, then went round to the library window, but the curtains were drawn. That's when I fetched the gardener." "Mr. Caulfield often locked his door?" Whimsy asked mildly. "Oh, yes, sir. Said he couldn't concentrate if people barged in with mundane matters." She sniffed, as though mundane matters included laundry, firewood, and mortal death. "Did he dine in last night?" "No, sir. He had supper in the village, at the vicarage, with Reverend Shale and Miss Evangeline. He walked back up just before 10. I saw his lamp bobbing down the drive from the pantry window. And the back door? Locked, as always, bolted too." "Indeed," murmured Whimsy. "Would you be so kind as to ask the gardener to join us?" The gardener, a slope-shouldered man named Briggs, arrived still clutching a pair of muddied secateurs, his face lined like poorly folded parchment. He confirmed Mrs. Wills's account and added that no one had used the service path that night. He'd swept it clean the evening before, and it was untouched in the morning mist. "You see," said Inspector Copley, a touch triumphant. "It must have been suicide. Nobody in, nobody out." "Possibly," Whimsy said, wandering toward the fire grate. "And yet it seems so unliterary, doesn't it? A man spends his life in letters and ends it in so final a punctuation. Did Mr. Caulfield often talk of despair?" Mrs. Wills shook her head firmly. "Not he. He was due to speak at the Historical Society next week. Had a new theory about the provenance of the Lesser Twing altar cross. Oh, he was quite lively about it yesterday morning. Sent Miss Evangeline a note in the post, he did." "Ah, yes, Miss Evangeline." Whimsy's eyes narrowed. "A curious figure. Niece, I believe. Came to live with him some 2 years ago. Just after her mother passed," the housekeeper confirmed. "Only kin she had. Pretty thing. Clever with her hands. Bit, sensitive, if you ask me." Whimsy merely nodded. "Sensitive, yes. The sort of girl who notices when a book is moved or a picture frame is tilted." She frowned. "Well, yes, I suppose so." When Miss Evangeline Caulfield arrived, summoned from the village via the constable, she entered the room with all the grace of a portrait come to life. Clad in navy blue with a neat feathered hat and gloves buttoned to the wrist, she possessed the kind of brittle calm only perfected by generations of quiet suffering. Her eyes were red, though no tears marred her cheeks. "Lord Whimsy," she said quietly, "you're here to help." "I do try," he replied, rising from his inspection of the fireplace tools. "May I offer condolences? I understand your uncle was rather dear to you." "Yes," she said. "He took me in, gave me a home. He was difficult, most scholars are. But he was not unkind, not to me." "And did you see him last night?" "We dined at the vicarage. He was in high spirits. Spoke a good deal about a letter he'd received, some academic rebuttal, I think. But he wouldn't show it to me. He said I'd laugh at the Latin." Whimsy's smile was fleeting. "Was it usual for him to keep correspondence hidden from you?" She hesitated. "Lately, yes, since he changed the will." "Ah, a change. That's always interesting. In your favour?" "I believe so. He said he intended to ensure I was provided for." "Did anyone else know of this change?" I don't know. He told me in confidence. He said the old will was outdated and that the trustees would grumble, but he didn't care." Whimsy nodded, then turned to the inspector. "I shall want to see that will. Both versions, if possible." "There's one locked in the strong box in the study," Copley replied. "The solicitor has the previous." "Splendid. Let's have a look." The current will, dated only 3 weeks prior, was brief and decisive. All assets, movable and immovable, were to pass to Miss Evangeline, barring a modest annuity for Mrs. Wills and a bequest to the Historical Society. The previous will, upon receipt from the solicitor later that day, was a fussy 12-page affair full of academic dedications, donations to libraries, and a rather generous provision for one Mr. Felix Bryce. "Who is this Bryce fellow?" Whimsy asked, lifting the old will with 2 fingers as though it might stain. "A fellow classicist," Evangeline said. "They worked together at Cambridge once, but they fell out over something scholarly, I think. Uncle called him an ornamental fraud." "A damning phrase," said Whimsy, "and suggestive." That evening the fog remained thick as wool. Whimsy, undeterred, requested a quiet dinner, and then took to pacing the library long after the others had retired. At precisely 11 o'clock he rang for Mrs. Wills and inquired casually about the placement of the candlesticks, whether they had been moved, or if she'd noticed anything unusual the night before. She replied in the negative, though she did mention something odd. The bell pull from the library had sounded once, faintly, around midnight. "I thought it strange," she said, "but when I came down to check, the door was locked and there was no reply. I assumed it had been a draught or fault in the wire." "But you didn't mention this before?" "I didn't think it relevant, my lord. I mean, he was—" "Yes," Whimsy said. "Dead, or so it seemed." He did not elaborate. The following morning, just as the sun attempted a feeble intrusion through the mist, Whimsy returned to the library alone. He walked the perimeter, touched the cool surface of the revolver still bagged for evidence, and tilted the portrait on the wall by 3 degrees. He stepped back and smiled. Then, hands in his pockets, he went in search of the vicar. Now generate the next section, building directly on the logic, tone, and pace established so far. The mystery should continue unfolding naturally, deepening our sense of time, motive, and character. Each detail must push the investigation forward. The vicar of Lesser Twing, the Reverend Alban Shale, was the sort of man whose facial hair carried more conviction than his sermons. His study smelled faintly of lavender polish and aging paper, and the curtains had been drawn back with military precision, as though sunlight were a necessary deterrent to theological laxity. Whimsy found him polishing a pair of brass candlesticks, which seemed symbolic somehow. "Ah, Lord Whimsy," said the vicar, setting down his cloth and gesturing toward a winged armchair. "A most dreadful business, this. Absolutely dreadful. Caulfield was a difficult man, of course, but we all have our foibles. I dare say even St. Jerome was occasionally testy." "No doubt," said Whimsy, seating himself. "And his Latin certainly left much to be desired." Reverend Shale gave a nervous chuckle. "Yes, quite. I heard you were called in. I suppose the inspector still believes in the locked room theory?" "For the moment," said Whimsy. "I, on the other hand, have grown suspicious of locked doors. They always seem to shut out more truth than they trap." The vicar nodded sagely, unsure whether that was philosophy or accusation. "You dined with Mr. Caulfield the night before last?" "Yes, he joined Miss Evangeline and myself for supper. Shepherd's pie and spotted dick, I'm afraid. Nothing terribly conspiratorial. We talked shop, Roman funerary rites, the absurdity of the new railway project, and some scurrilous business about the Society's latest acquisition." "Scurrilous?" "Well, Horace was convinced the altar cross donated by the late Lady Grenshaw was a Victorian replica. He said the etchings were too clean, too shallow. He'd written a paper, I believe." "Did he seem in good spirits?" "Oh, delighted, positively giddy about his discoveries. He did grumble about a letter he'd received, called it a pompous tantrum from a pompous fraud, but otherwise he was quite voluble." "Would you say he was theatrical?" Shale looked puzzled. "Theatrical? Yes, I suppose he liked an audience. He had a habit of quoting things, rather liked to surprise one with Latin tags mid-pudding." "Indeed," said Whimsy. "Do you recall when he left?" "Just before 10, he walked home. Miss Evangeline left a few minutes later. We'd discussed the upcoming flower festival. She's on the committee, you know, has a real knack for hydrangeas." Whimsy filed this irrelevant fact away, as one might tuck a playing card up a sleeve. "Tell me, Reverend, have you ever met a Mr. Felix Bryce?" The vicar frowned. "Bryce? I believe he lectured briefly at Magdalen. Caulfield couldn't stand him, thought him a showman, a man of considerable surface and little substance. Why do you ask?" "Oh, I collect pedants," Whimsy said airily. "Thank you, Reverend. Most enlightening." On his way back to Brackendale Lodge, Whimsy detoured past the post office. A brief chat with Miss Withers, the postmistress, who adored nothing so much as a dignified interrogation, yielded that a telegram had arrived for Mr. Caulfield 3 days prior. It was signed F. Bryce and bore the tantalizing phrase, retract publication, or consequences imminent. Back at the lodge, he shared this with Inspector Copley, who scratched his chin in frustration. Threats, then, a motive at last. Or a provocation, Whimsy mused, depending on one's appetite for irony. Bryce would have needed a key to get in, or a method. We've checked the grounds thoroughly. No footprints, no tampering, no evidence of entry. Precisely, said Whimsy, which makes it all the more interesting that someone did get in. He retired to the library once more and spent an hour examining the bell pull, the fireplace, and a small patch of discoloured carpet beneath the side table. Then, without comment, he rang for Miss Evangeline. She came quickly, gloves in hand, her composure faltering only when she stepped into the room where her uncle had died. Whimsy gestured to the settee. "I shan't keep you long. I merely wondered if your uncle had a habit of pacing." "Pacing?" "Yes, walking up and down as he dictated, perhaps. Reading aloud, that sort of thing." "Sometimes," she said slowly, "especially when thinking. He'd walk from the desk to the fire and back again. Why?" "Oh, only that the carpet shows more wear along one path than the other. Odd for a man with symmetrical habits." She said nothing. "One more thing," Whimsy said. "I wonder if you could tell me, has the grandfather clock in the hall always struck 7 minutes late?" Her eyes darted toward the door. I don't know," she said. "I never noticed." "But Mrs. Wills did. And your uncle was obsessed with time. He would never have let such a thing stand. Yet it has struck late these past 4 days. Exactly 7 minutes. Just enough to throw off an alibi. Curious, don't you think?" Evangeline rose, her face pale. "If you'll excuse me, Lord Whimsy, I'm very tired." "Of course," said Whimsy, rising with her. "But do rest lightly, Miss Caulfield. I fear the truth keeps time more precisely than your uncle's clock." She left without reply. Whimsy turned to the silent library, walked once more the path between the desk and the fire, and paused by the chessboard. The Black King was still toppled. He picked it up, placed it upright, and smiled. "Now," he said softly to himself, "let's see who's playing white." The morning mist had at last begun to lift, but Brackendale Lodge still seemed to sit outside time, wrapped in its own air of scholarly menace. Whimsy, breakfasting on toast that had clearly given up on being crisp, announced between bites that he required a visit to the solicitor's office in the village. "No one who rewrites a will so dramatically," he said to Colonel Marchbanks, "does so without explanation, or if they do, they certainly mean for someone to stumble upon one posthumously." Marchbanks, who had only just poured milk into his tea, blinked. "You don't still think it was murder?" "My dear fellow, I think everything is murder until proven otherwise. This toast, for example, possibly manslaughter." He stood, straightened his cuffs, and donned his hat with ceremony. "Back in a jiffy. Try not to be arrested in my absence." The solicitor's office was housed in a damp little building tucked behind the churchyard, with a wisteria vine trying gamely to strangle the drain pipe. Mr. Geoffrey Lincoln, solicitor to the late Mr. Caulfield, proved to be a man so dry that Whimsy suspected he powdered his tea. "Yes, I drew up both versions of the will," Lincoln confirmed, adjusting his pince-nez. "The earlier one in 32, the second just last month." "Any objections raised?" Whimsy asked. "Any quarrels, raised voices, melodramatic clutchings of chests?" Lincoln permitted himself the ghost of a smile. "Nothing so exciting. Mr. Caulfield was calm and deliberate, said he had no more illusions about his colleagues, and that his niece had been woefully undervalued." That was his phrase. "A man who rewrites his legacy is rarely idle," Whimsy murmured. "Was there any mention of pressure, blackmail, undue influence?" Lincoln stiffened. "Certainly not. I'd have noted any such concern." The will was witnessed by Mrs. Wills and Miss Caulfield, in fact. Both at once? No, on different days. He had them signed sequentially. Odd, but not illegal. Odd indeed, said Whimsy. I wonder, was there a letter or notes regarding the change? Not that I recall. I did retain a copy of the correspondence in my files. Would you care to see it? Whimsy nodded, and Lincoln retrieved a thin file marked Caulfield, Horace. Inside was a single sheet of creamy notepaper, densely written in the same meticulous script Whimsy had seen on the translation in the study. The note said, "A man must account for what he leaves behind. Let others dissect my reputation. I leave what I may to the only mind I trust to complete the thought." Rather poetic, Whimsy murmured. Did he mention what thought that was? None to me. Whimsy thanked the solicitor, and before leaving asked a final question. Did Mr. Caulfield have a spare key to the library? Only one, as far as I know. And he kept it in his desk drawer, hidden beneath a Latin grammar, I believe. Splendid, said Whimsy. If murderers would only use the front door, life would be dreadfully easier. Back at the lodge, he found Inspector Copley interviewing Miss Evangeline again. She was seated in the parlour this time, flanked by a rather sinister aspidistra, her hands folded like a governess expecting bad poetry. I've nothing more to add, she was saying. Uncle was well. Strange, yes, but what scholar isn't? Strange indeed, Whimsy interjected, seating himself without invitation. Miss Caulfield, when you found the bell had sounded, midnight, I believe, did you immediately go to the library? No, I didn't want to wake the house, she said. I waited until morning. It didn't sound urgent. And you didn't think it odd, the bell sounding from a locked room? Her eyes narrowed slightly. I assumed it was a mechanical fault. Whimsy nodded, apparently satisfied. And did you ever find the silver salver? She looked up. What? The salver? The one you brought in with his supper the night before? There wasn't one, she said slowly. He dined at the vicarage, remember? Ah, of course. I must have confused it with a dream, said Whimsy. Curious things, dreams. They often know more than we do. He left the room whistling a few bars from the Mikado, then made his way again to the library. There he examined the bell-pull mechanism more closely and noted the peculiar fraying near the base. He traced the wire down through the wall and found, some distance along the corridor, a small panel ajar. Behind it, the bell wire had been spliced, rerouted through a crude mechanism attached to the central heating duct. It could be triggered remotely. Ghosts ringing bells from the grave, he murmured, or clever hands priming a false impression of life. Just then, a knock sounded behind him. It was Colonel Marchbanks. Peter, letter just arrived, no sender, addressed to you, oddly enough. Whimsy opened the envelope. Inside, a clipping from the Times Literary Supplement, a review of a recent paper by Horace Caulfield in which he discredited the published theories of one Felix Bryce. In the margin was a note, scribbled hastily in pencil. You were wrong about the cross. You were wrong about the girl. Dead men can still be edited. No signature. Whimsy folded the paper slowly. Well, he said to the colonel, that's either a confession or a literary critique with delusions of grandeur. That evening, just as twilight began to stretch shadows across the parlour, Whimsy convened a quiet gathering. Inspector Copley, Miss Caulfield, Reverend Shale, Mrs. Wills, even Briggs the gardener, who looked as though he would rather be pruning hedges in the dark. Whimsy stood before the fire, one hand tucked behind his back. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, you are all here because something very old has just happened, something older than this house, older than even Latin. A deception, carefully curated, lovingly rehearsed, and deeply, desperately human. He smiled, and like all good Latin sentences, it ends in blood. The gathered company watched Whimsy with polite curiosity, though each harboured their own silent apprehensions. The flickering firelight cast long shadows, turning Reverend Shale's clerical collar into something faintly ominous, and lending Miss Evangeline a haunted air she did little to dispel. Whimsy cleared his throat delicately. "We are not merely here to lament the passing of Mr. Horace Caulfield. We are here to unravel the intricacies of a puzzle, one that begins, quite ironically, with a misaligned clock." He paused, allowing the weight of that to settle. 4 days ago, the grandfather clock in the hall began striking 7 minutes late, and this detail, seemingly trivial, serves as a keystone for the entire investigation. Why? Because Mr. Caulfield was a man possessed by precision. His timetables were exacting, his punctuality near obsessive. Inspector Copley nodded grimly. "The late clock explains why the police timeline didn't add up. The supposed time of death is shifted by 7 minutes. "Precisely," Whimsy said. "Now, Miss Caulfield, you told me you were unaware of this discrepancy." "I confess, yes," she replied quietly. "I didn't pay attention to the clock." "Understandable," said Whimsy. "But Mrs. Wills noticed, a woman who attends to detail as is her duty. The clock's retardation was no accident. It was deliberate, a mechanism to distort time and alibi. Yet how does this connect to the bell pull in the library?" Reverend Shale interjected. "Ah, the bell," Whimsy smiled thinly. "A device rigged to give the impression of life after death, ringing faintly at midnight when no one was there to answer. A brilliant stroke of misdirection." "Who would benefit from such an elaborate ruse?" Miss Evangeline asked, voice trembling. "Someone who wished to confuse the timeline," Whimsy replied. "Or to distract attention from a particular detail overlooked by the untrained eye." He turned to Inspector Copley. "May I remind you that the door was locked from the inside, windows latched, no sign of forced entry. The revolver was found beside the body, an obvious candidate for suicide." "Obvious but not conclusive," said Whimsy. "Do continue," said Copley. Whimsy began to pace slowly. "Our victim, Horace Caulfield, was engaged in an academic feud with Felix Bryce, a man whose recent threats were well documented, yet Bryce had no means of entry to the lodge. The grounds were intact, the paths undisturbed. The key was kept in the desk. Until recently," Whimsy added. "Until recently?" Mrs. Wills gasped. "Yes," said Whimsy. "You see, Mrs. Wills, you mentioned that the door was locked this morning when you found the body. But how then did the murderer gain access last night? If we exclude forced entry, and there was none, then the answer must lie with someone who had a key." Miss Evangeline stiffened imperceptibly. "I believe," Whimsy continued, "that the murderer is someone inside this house. Someone with access and motive. Someone who could manipulate time, rig a bell, and wield a revolver." A hush fell over the room. "Miss Evangeline," Whimsy said gently, "you stand to inherit everything under the new will. The old will favoured Felix Bryce, who had motive and cause to see Mr. Caulfield dead. But without access, Bryce is innocent of the act, only guilty of threats." The niece looked down, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "You cannot prove anything." "Not yet," Whimsy admitted. "But I do know this. Mr. Caulfield was not alone the night he died. He had visitors. Confrontation ensued, a struggle, and finally, a fatal shot." He turned to the assembled group. "There is one detail overlooked so far, the cold beef on a silver salver, brought as supper. Who brought it? Who ordered it?" Mrs. Wills faltered. "It was Miss Evangeline's doing. She insisted her uncle dine separately at the vicarage but sent food here as a courtesy. Ah, said Whimsy, an act of kindness or one of cunning, because the beef was cold and the salver silver, prone to fingerprints. He moved to the desk, carefully lifting a silver salver from beneath a cushion. Look here. He pointed to a smudge near the handle. This was wiped hastily, but not thoroughly. Fingerprints remain, some partial, some smeared. Inspector Copley nodded to the forensic team. We'll have them analysed immediately. Whimsy glanced at Miss Evangeline. You see, my dear, the killer left their mark, both figuratively and literally, and it's a mark only someone intimately familiar with this house could have made. Miss Evangeline's eyes widened, but she said nothing. Now, Whimsy said, let us consider the revolver. A single shot, clean and precise. But was it self-inflicted? The angle, the powder burns, the residue, all suggest close contact, but not necessarily suicide. He turned to the fireplace where ashes still lay cold. There is evidence here. Microscopic, perhaps, but vital. And it leads me to one final question. Who had the opportunity, the means, and the motive? He paused, then smiled thinly. I believe we are about to find out. Shadows lengthened in the room as Whimsy's eyes settled on each person in turn. No one spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock, still lagging behind by 7 minutes. The stillness of the room pressed heavily, like velvet drapes smothering any stray noise. Whimsy's gaze, sharp as a rapier, rested on each occupant, weighing their silent reactions. The cleverness of the setup, the manipulation of time and space bespoke not just cunning, but familiarity. A familiarity that only those within these walls could claim. Let us consider, then, Whimsy began, voice smooth as aged claret, the curious case of the missing salver. Mrs. Wills cleared her throat, looking rather like a hen surprised by a fox in the hen-house. I swear, my lord, I only brought the tray into the dining-room. After that, I did not see the salver again. And Miss Evangeline, you claimed no knowledge of such a tray being present? The young woman shifted, a flicker of unease, crossing her carefully maintained composure. I sent the food to the vicarage. No tray came back. Odd, said Whimsy, stepping toward the fireplace. A silver salver does not simply vanish unless it is hidden deliberately. He moved swiftly to the tall bookcase lining the far wall and pulled a seemingly innocuous volume. With a soft click, a secret panel swung open, revealing a small recess. There, Whimsy said, withdrawing the salver. It gleamed coldly, its surface faintly smeared with fingerprints. He laid it carefully on the desk and addressed the room once more. Now the question is, why hide the salver? To conceal evidence? To confuse the timeline? Reverend Shale shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I cannot imagine such duplicity in this household. Surely the truth will emerge. Truth, Reverend, often wears a mask of propriety, Whimsy replied, but the mask slips and the veneer cracks. His eyes fell on the gardener, Briggs, who had maintained a stoic silence throughout. Mr. Briggs, you mentioned the paths were undisturbed overnight. Yes, sir. I walk them every morning at dawn. No new footprints, no broken twigs. Yet the bell rang at midnight. Someone was inside, or at least had access. Briggs hesitated, then said quietly, I once saw Miss Evangeline near the library late at night. Thought it odd then? Indeed, Whimsy said. And the locked door? The spliced bell wire? Yes, Briggs confirmed. Someone had to know how to rig it. Whimsy turned back to Miss Evangeline, who now looked cornered but unyielding. Miss Caulfield, your secretiveness over the will, your presence near the library at odd hours, your knowledge of the house's intricacies, all suggest more than innocence. "I loved my uncle," she burst out. "You think I could murder him?" "Love," Whimsy said softly, "is a curious thing. Sometimes it inspires, sometimes it suffocates, and sometimes it kills." He took a step closer, voice lowering conspiratorially. "Your uncle was a man beset by enemies, academic and personal, but his closest enemy may have lived under his own roof." Silence hung heavy. Then, with a sudden breath, Miss Evangeline's facade cracked. "He was going to disinherit me, change his mind at the last minute. Felix Bryce promised to ruin us both if I got everything." "Ah," said Whimsy, "a motive born of fear and betrayal. And yet the timing, the rigged clock, the false bell, shows premeditation. You could not have acted alone." "Who else?" Evangeline demanded. "The butler?" Whimsy suggested lightly. "The vicar? Or someone more unexpected?" The vicar's lips tightened. "But I assure you," he said, "I kept my keys where all could see." "Too visible to be safe," Whimsy murmured. Suddenly Mrs. Wills spoke, voice steady despite the tension. "I saw Mr. Caulfield arguing with a man in the garden last week, late one evening. A stranger, tall, thin, with a scar on his left hand." "A visitor?" Whimsy asked. "No one we knew. I thought it odd." "Scar on the left hand," Whimsy murmured. "That may be a vital clue." He paced slowly. "We must identify this man, but first the final piece, the revolver. Clean, neat, no signs of struggle, a professional's work." He faced the room. Someone staged the scene to mimic suicide, but overlooked the little details: the clock, the bell, the salver, the scars, and most crucially, the shattered alibi. His eyes rested again on Miss Evangeline. "You had motive, you had access, but did you have the nerve to pull the trigger?" Her breath caught. "Or did someone use your name as a scapegoat?" The room was thick with expectation. Whimsy smiled thinly. "Now we wait." The drawing-room remained silent long after Whimsy's pronouncement. The faint crackle of the fire punctuated the hush, mingling with the steady tick of the grandfather clock, as if time itself waited with bated breath. The suspects sat as if frozen in portraiture, each a study in strain and suppressed calculation. Lord Peter moved with feline grace to the desk, producing a small envelope retrieved earlier from beneath a blotter in the late Professor Caulfield's study. He held it aloft with a scholar's delicacy, as though it might crumble at his touch. "A curious thing," he remarked, turning the envelope over. "Addressed simply, to be opened only in the event of my sudden death." Gasps and murmurs fluttered through the room. "Sealed with the Caulfield crest," Whimsy added, before neatly slicing it open with a letter opener shaped like a bronze serpent. "Shall we?" No one spoke as he unfolded the pages within. His voice was low and precise as he read aloud. "If this reaches your hands, then I am gone, and likely not of natural causes. My fears have crystallized, and my instincts speak louder than my reason. I believe my life is in danger from within these walls, though I cannot yet name my assailant. To Miss Evangeline I bequeath my books and personal effects, though I suspect she will find less satisfaction in those than once imagined. To Felix Bryce, if he still hovers at the threshold of my affairs, I offer nothing but contempt." Whimsy paused, brow lifting subtly. "Quite the testament, eh?" he continued. "But if my death appears a suicide, it is not. Know this, whoever reads these words, I am not a man to choose the coward's way. Look to the library, look to the past. The truth lies buried in both." A hush fell again. Mrs. Wills wept softly into a crumpled handkerchief. Reverend Shale sat stiffly upright, hands clenched in his lap. Briggs looked suddenly pale, his fingernails digging into the arms of the chair. "The past?" said Whimsy, folding the letter. "It always comes back to claim its due, doesn't it?" He paced again, this time toward the hearth, pausing before the portrait of Professor Caulfield's late wife. "You know," he said, his tone light and conversational, "I found something else in the professor's study, a telegram, dated 6 weeks ago, from one Dr. Ambrose Halliwell." "Who's that?" asked Briggs, voice gruff with nerves. "A neurologist," said Wimsey, "specializing in degenerative conditions. According to this telegram, the professor had been diagnosed with early signs of aphasia. His speech was faltering. His thoughts were becoming confused. He knew he was slipping." "Then perhaps he did take his own life," said Miss Evangeline, her voice tinged with bitter irony. "Ah, but no," said Wimsey, "because he wrote that letter after the diagnosis, and that letter declared unequivocally, 'It is not.'" He spun slowly on his heel, taking in the room. The diagnosis merely made him more aware, more paranoid perhaps, but not suicidal. He felt something, sensed it coming for him. A shadow in his house. He turned sharply to the vicar. "Reverend Shale, you and the professor were not, I gather, close?" "We disagreed," Shale said, stiffly. "On theological and ethical grounds. He was an atheist in all but name." "But you remained in contact?" Shale nodded once. "We shared history." "Indeed," said Wimsey. "History? That splendid tangle." He tapped his finger against his chin. "The truth lies buried in both, library and past." So I searched the oldest books in the professor's collection. In one, a volume of letters from a defrocked bishop in the Second Empire, I found a pressed violet and a folded legal document. A deed. "A deed!" Miss Evangeline leaned forward, her eyes glinting. "To an abandoned cottage," Wimsey confirmed. "Purchased under the professor's name in 1910, located near Hathersedge Moor." "Why would he hide that?" asked Mrs. Wills, puzzled. "Because, my dear Mrs. Wills, the cottage was not for his use. It was for someone else, someone he paid to disappear." Briggs stood abruptly, knocking his chair over. "That's a lie," Wimsey's eyes flashed. "Not a lie, Mr. Briggs, a cover. The man who vanished from this village after the scandal of 1911, accused of sedition, blasphemy and blackmail, an apprentice of the professor's, one Harold Quinn." Briggs turned ghost pale. "You see," said Wimsey softly, "I recognized you from an old photograph in the back of the bishop's letters. You've been hiding in plain sight." Miss Evangeline gasped. "Briggs?" "No," said Wimsey, "not Briggs. Quinn. The man the professor betrayed once, then kept hidden, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps fear. But guilt has a shelf life, and I suspect the professor was preparing to reveal the truth before his death." Quinn's voice was low and venomous. "He owed me everything. I did the dirty work, the real research, but he got the glory, the titles, the chair. And then he told me to vanish." "And you did," said Wimsey. "Until recently, until his guilt wavered and your secret salary stopped. You returned under a new name, and when he threatened to expose it all—" "I silenced him," Quinn said, almost peacefully. "I took back what he stole, but I made it look clean, neat." "You even rigged the clock and the bell," Wimsey said, "to build your alibi." "I was careful." "Almost," said Wimsey, "but you forgot the salver, and the professor's letter, and me." Quinn lunged then, too quickly, too desperately. But Wimsey stepped aside as if dancing. A deft hand swept a candlestick from the mantelpiece and brought it down with a dull crack. Quinn crumpled, moaning. Briggs, no, Quinn, was taken away in shackles by the village constable, his past finally unmasked. Wimsey stood at the window watching the constable's cart vanish into the deep mist. "A clever man," he said. "But the past, the past is cleverer still." He turned to the fire and stirred it thoughtfully. "Now," he murmured, "some tea, I think. And perhaps a poem. I find murder sharpens the palate. For verse." The next morning, dawned pale and sodden, a fine mist clinging to the skeletal trees as though the landscape itself had absorbed the lingering shock of revelation. Inside the manor, life resumed with brittle politeness. Teacups clinked, toast cooled, and silence was passed around like a serving dish. Lord Peter Wimsey, however, was already at work, ensconced in the professor's study, surrounded by the loose threads of the past. The fire had gone out in the grate. He had made no effort to relight it. A sheaf of documents lay spread before him, papers from the professor's safe, old manuscripts, a cracked leather notebook filled with spidery Latin, and the strange deed to the cottage at Hathersedge Moor. Wimsey traced its inky lines with a forefinger, frowning. "Curious," he murmured. At that moment Bunter entered quietly, bearing a cup of hot coffee and a telegram. "From Scotland Yard, my lord," he said. "Excellent," said Wimsey, accepting both with a nod. "Have they confirmed it?" "Yes, my lord. Harold Quinn was presumed dead in 1912. Body found in the Dartmoor bogs, or so they thought. No dental records at the time." Wimsey sipped the coffee. "Then our Mr. Briggs truly did rise from the grave?" "He'll hang," Bunter said mildly. "No doubt," said Wimsey. "But what I find more intriguing, Bunter, is why now? What broke the dam?" "Desperation?" Wimsey's expression soured. "Or vanity? Some sins ferment into pride. I think Quinn wanted to be seen, perhaps even recognized." He pushed the papers aside and stared at the window, fogged with breath. "Do you believe in redemption, Bunter?" Bunter gave a faint smile. "Not professionally, my lord." Wimsey chuckled softly. "Nor I." A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Miss Evangeline, her poise cracked at the edges like old porcelain. "May I speak with you?" she asked. "Alone?" "Certainly," said Wimsey, gesturing to a chair. "Please." She sat, hands folded in her lap like a penitent schoolgirl. "Was it all true?" she asked. "About Mr. Briggs?" "Yes," said Wimsey, "though I imagine the name Briggs will soon go the way of all aliases." "And he killed my uncle?" Wimsey paused, then nodded. "He did, and very nearly got away with it." She looked down. "I thought I knew him. We used to play chess." Wimsey's brow arched. "Chess is a game best suited to murderers, Miss Evangeline. It teaches detachment, sacrifice, the long game." She gave a dry, bitter laugh. "He said once that pawns were the most powerful pieces because no one watches them closely." "A revealing sentiment," said Wimsey. "And apt." She rose slowly. "What will happen now?" "Well," said Wimsey, rising too, "the police will tidy up the legal matters. Your uncle's estate will be yours, I suspect, and the cottage at Hathersedge will likely be demolished." "Good," she said softly. "Let the bog take it back." She paused at the door, then turned. "Do you think my uncle knew about Briggs?" "Yes," said Wimsey without hesitation. "I think he always knew. But guilt is a strange creature. It builds altars to the very thing it fears." Miss Evangeline nodded once and was gone. Later that afternoon, Reverend Shale requested a word. The vicar's gaunt face was paler than usual, and his fingers trembled as he removed his gloves. "I must confess something," he said, before Wimsey could offer a chair. "I knew Harold Quinn, not only as the man he once was, but the man he became." Wimsey said nothing. "I saw him one stormy night outside the rectory. It must have been 2 years ago. He told me who he was, asked for help." "And you gave it?" Wimsey asked gently. "I gave him absolution," Shale replied, voice brittle. "He spoke of suffering, of being erased. He wept." Wimsey's eyes narrowed. "You knew he was here all along?" "I suspected," the vicar admitted, "but I thought perhaps he was changed. Perhaps silence would serve justice better than noise." "That's a dangerous philosophy," said Wimsey. Shale looked stricken. "Do you think I share in his guilt?" "I think," said Whimsy, "you share in his shadow." The vicar bowed his head. "Then I will resign my post. Let the diocese decide." "I think that would be appropriate," said Whimsy. And so the house emptied in time. Miss Evangeline left for Cambridge to resume her studies, carrying with her a trunk of books and a painting of her uncle as a younger man, smiling in the sunlight, unaware of the doom to come. Mrs. Wills departed for Bath to live with a sister. Briggs, Quin, was carted to London in chains. The vicar vanished quietly, a note left behind, quoting Job, "And I only am escaped alone to tell thee." As for Lord Peter Wimsey, he remained one final evening at Caulfield House. He walked its echoing halls, pausing in each room, as if committing them to memory. In the library, he stood before the fireless hearth, where truth had been peeled back like plaster. Bunter found him there past midnight. "Shall I pack, my lord?" "In a moment," said Whimsy. He reached for a final volume on the shelf, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, and opened it to a passage he marked years ago. "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." He closed the book and placed it carefully back in its niche. "Now," he said, straightening his collar, "let's go home." And so they did, leaving the manor to its silence, and the moor to its fog. The past, for now, had been answered. Autumn descended with quiet finality. Leaves browned and fell in spirals across the lawn of Caulfield House, whispering secrets to the gravel below. Inside, the rooms lay dormant, their shutters drawn, their fires long since extinguished. The manor had become once more what it had always threatened to be, a reliquary of memory, shuttered and hollow. Lord Peter Wimsey, for his part, had returned to London, but not to forget. He bore the case with him as one carries a troublesome poem, deciphered, yes, but never truly concluded. It lingered in his mind like a refrain. One fogged morning, while seated before a breakfast tray in Piccadilly, Wimsey received an envelope of heavy vellum, sealed in wax and without return address. The handwriting was unmistakable, fine, slanted, a scholar's hand. It belonged to none other than Professor Mortimer Caulfield, or rather, it had. He broke the seal. "My dear Lord Peter, if you are reading this, I am almost certainly dead, and you, nosy devil, have sniffed your way to the truth. I have no doubt you've exposed the man who calls himself Briggs, and rightly so. A parasite like that thrives only in the dark. I confess I invited him back, not consciously, never that. But I failed to bolt the door. Perhaps guilt does that. Perhaps my own obsession with redemption became a beacon for the damned. Briggs, or Quin, was never clever enough to invent evil. He simply wore it like a suit. He fooled no one, really, not even me. There's a passage in Plotinus I've often misquoted. The soul, in its shame, returns to the source from which it came. I wonder if my soul remembers where it's from. You'll find the original copy of that quote, with marginalia, hidden behind the fireplace panel in the study. I couldn't bear to part with it. Tell Evangeline I'm sorry. She was always the best of us. Yours in truth and trespass. M.C. Wimsey folded the letter slowly, like a priest closing a psalter. He did not smile. That evening he returned to Caulfield House. The air was damp with the smell of sodden leaves and distant smoke. Inside, dust coated the stair rail, and the echoes of footfalls came too quickly, as though the house wished to speak. In the study, by the hearth, he found it, the hidden panel, a small press, a click, and it swung open with the reluctant sigh of old hinges. Within there lay a folio. Greek letters inscribed on handmade paper, annotated in fine pencil. A single pressed violet had been left between the pages, dried, crumbling. Wimsey closed the panel, replaced the chair, and left the room dark. The inquest into Mortimer Caulfield's death was straightforward now, at least on paper. Quinn had been charged and arraigned. A trial would follow, but Whimsy declined to attend. The matter had passed beyond the reach of cleverness. It was not long after that Whimsy found himself at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, not for investigation, but for solace. He wandered the cloisters with gloved hands and a furrowed brow, lost in contemplation. A student passed him, a girl in horn-rimmed glasses, and whispered his name as though it were part of a poem. He didn't hear her. In the dim recesses of the Special Collections Room, Whimsy came upon something else, a fragment of a medieval psalter illuminated with strange symbols. Beneath the Latin script ran a marginal note in archaic English. "The dead do speak if ye know the tongue." He stared at the phrase for a long time. Outside, a crow cawed. Bunter, ever punctual, met him at the station on the return to London. It was raining. "Did you find what you were looking for, my lord?" "No," said Whimsy. "But I found something else. A sort of ache. Would you like a warm supper?" "I would like a world," said Whimsy, "in which men like Quinn don't survive by wearing other people's skins." Bunter said nothing. Sometimes silence was the most appropriate service. They rode back to Piccadilly in silence. The carriage rattled against the cobbles. Lights blurred through rain-slicked windows. Whimsy looked out, murmuring more to himself than to Bunter. There is a weight in things remembered, heavier than lead. Weeks passed. The manor was officially placed under probate review. Evangeline, now formally the heiress, sent word that she intended to donate most of the estate's holdings to the university. Her uncle's personal library would be catalogued and preserved in perpetuity, a temple of ghosts, she called it. One final letter arrived by post, a thin hand-addressed note in lavender ink. "Lord Peter, do not think me sentimental, but I believe you saved me, not only from Briggs, but from a sort of erasure. I have found myself again in the wreckage. Thank you. Evangeline Caulfield." Whimsy placed the letter in a drawer already filled with similar tokens, lost watches, pressed flowers, unsent telegrams. And then he stood, took up his coat, and faced the London air. A case had ended, but nothing, truly, was ever concluded. The season turned once more, as it always does, and London became a city of frost. Gas lamps hissed softly along the embankment. The Thames rolled on beneath its skin of fog, dark and eternal. In a study lined with books and silence, Lord Peter Whimsy sat in his armchair, one long leg folded over the other, and stared into a fire that no longer warmed him. The case was over. That phrase, so often a balm, now felt hollow. The guilty had been named, the dead mourned, justice of a sort had been done. But the thing would not leave him. It hovered, like mist, around the edges of his reason. He was accustomed to logical knots, to crimes born of greed or desperation. But this had felt more ancient, more decayed, like some rootless weed clawing up from the depths of the human soul. He turned, absently, to the pianoforte. His fingers wandered the keys with a ghost's touch. A scrap of Bach emerged, then dissolved. Bunter entered quietly with a tray. "Your tea, my lord." "Thank you, Bunter." He did not touch it. A pause. "My lord," said Bunter, in his gentlest voice. "Perhaps it is not the puzzle that troubles you, but what it left behind." Whimsy looked up. "The dust, Bunter, it's always the dust, isn't it? You clear a room and still the dust clings to the curtains and the corners of your thoughts." He stood and walked to the window. The city beyond was etched in frost. A woman hurried by with a child in tow. A man sold roasted chestnuts beneath a flickering gaslight. The world had resumed its ordinary tragedies. "I suppose," Whimsy murmured, "that Caulfield was right. Evil doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply borrows a name, puts on a familiar coat, and waits in the library until someone turns their back." Some weeks later, an exhibition opened at the Bodleian Library. It was titled The Caulfield Collection, Margins of the Mind. Scholars attended, papers were read. A minor scandal was stirred by the discovery of several annotations that suggested Mortimer Caulfield had once entertained a deep fascination with apocryphal theology, including the notion of the phantom soul, a belief that in rare cases a man might lose his soul in life and still walk among the living, vacant, cold, and yet smiling. Whimsy attended in silence, moving from glass case to glass case. He paused before a fragment of illuminated vellum bearing a peculiar inscription in red ink. "He who wears another's skin forgets the feel of his own. He did not stay for the wine." Evangeline Caulfield left England the following spring. She boarded a ship to Algiers and from there wrote letters to various friends, each brighter than the last, filled with sunlight, ruins, and the smell of cinnamon markets. In one letter to Lord Peter, she wrote, "Do you remember the night in the drawing room when we spoke of ghosts? I think now they are not the dead but the regrets we carry forward. Mine is growing lighter with each sunrise. I hope yours does too." Whimsy read the letter in a garden where magnolias bloomed despite the chill. He folded it carefully and placed it in the breast pocket of his jacket beside his heart. Time, in its unhurried way, resumed its work. The newspapers forgot about the Caulfield murder after the trial. Quinn, or Briggs, or whatever name he had borrowed last, was convicted. The courtroom had been cold, the verdict swift. But even there, a certain chill lingered behind the eyes of the man who had so artfully mimicked sincerity. The judge remarked on the cunning of the crime, the press on its theatrical cruelty, Whimsy on neither. He left the court early and went to sit in the chapel of a nearby hospital. The candlelight there did not accuse, it merely flickered. On the 1st of May, a letter arrived from Harriet. It was short. "Peter, I dreamed last night that you were standing in the fog and someone called your name. But you didn't answer. You only turned and walked away. Come home soon. H." He wrote no reply, but the next morning packed a small case and took the train to Oxford. She met him at the station and said nothing, only took his arm. That night, over 2 cups of tea and one of Harriet's poems, still unfinished, Peter Whimsy finally allowed himself to weep. He wept not for Caulfield, nor for the girl who might have died, nor even for the wickedness that so deftly hides in drawing rooms and old books. He wept for the great and quiet weight of knowledge that to see clearly is sometimes to see pain, and that truth, like fire, burns both ways. And so it ended, as all things do, not with a pistol shot or a cry in the dark, but with a man sitting by a fire, eyes closed, listening to the rustle of paper and the distant sound of footsteps returning home. The case of Caulfield House faded from the papers. The house itself stood still, waiting for the next season of leaves to fall. And somewhere, perhaps in a place deeper than dream, the shadows stirred and sighed, and slept again. Spring in London crept in gently, with lilac on the wind, and catkins trembling beside the gates of old houses. The Caulfield affair had drifted from public memory like smoke from a spent fire. But in the private corridors of intellect, in libraries, salons, and university halls, it lingered, like the residue of something half forgotten, yet unnervingly close. Lord Peter Whimsy had returned to his normal occupations, or such semblance of normal as a man like Whimsy ever indulged. There were committee meetings, a minor inquiry into forged incunabula, and an evening at the Royal Society for a lecture on the use of cryptograms in medieval heretical texts. He appeared himself again, impeccable, ironic, dashing in that deliberately negligent fashion which drew the admiration of women and the silent irritation of lesser men. And yet Bunter noticed the pause in the morning routine. The way his lordship's eyes would rest for a moment too long on the corner of the newspaper where no headline lay. Or how, in the drawing-room, he would sometimes pick up a book only to stare at its cover, unopened, for the better part of an hour. There was no mention of the Caulfields, not allowed, but silence itself had taken on a particular density in the Whimsy household. Then came the curious letter from Professor Alan Wycherley. The envelope bore the stamp of Magdalen College, Cambridge. The handwriting was precise, steeply slanted, with a touch of the antique. Inside, a note. My dear Lord Peter, forgive the abruptness of this message, but I believe a matter has surfaced which may, to your peculiar sensibilities, be of interest. It concerns the private notes of Mortimer Caulfield, recently turned up in an archive box, misplaced in 1897. An error I can only attribute to a combination of moths and undergraduate laziness. The contents are unnerving. I have taken the liberty of enclosing a sample page. Perhaps you might find the time to call on me before the month's end. I would value your insight and, dare I say it, your discretion. Yours in scholarly exasperation, A. Wycherley. Lord Peter laid the letter flat on his desk and turned to the enclosed document. It was a parchment leaf, evidently torn from a folio, with no heading or pagination, only densely written marginalia in Caulfield's unmistakable hand. The soul, if dislocated, may not scream. It may smile instead. There is a doctrine lost to orthodoxy, but whispered among the radical Taborites, that the devil does not tempt us to do evil, but to become someone else entirely. And is that not the cleverest kind of ruin? Below this, in a second hand, smaller, tighter, and unmistakably more modern, appeared the words, "What if the mirror lies? What if it remembers a different face than yours?" Whimsy arrived in Cambridge 2 days later. The porter recognized him instantly and greeted him with a blend of warmth and awe. Professor Wycherley was waiting in his study, surrounded by tottering stacks of illuminated texts and half-unfurled scrolls. He looked up from a magnifying lens as Whimsy entered. "My dear lord," he said, rising with some effort, "I'm grateful you came. You've no idea the absurdity of this find." "I rarely underestimate absurdity," said Whimsy. "It has the unfortunate habit of being true." The professor motioned him to a seat, then produced a folio box from a nearby table. It was part of a failed catalogue attempt during the expansion of the Bodleians' theological holdings in the 1890s. Caulfield, it seems, had been exchanging letters with an obscure Czech monk, Brother Lutoslav, who believed in the transference of personality by linguistic mimicry. A sort of possession by prose. Precisely. The theory, utter nonsense of course, suggests that if one immerses themselves deeply enough in the written confessions or linguistic patterns of another, they may begin to echo them, not only outwardly but inwardly, eventually becoming indistinguishable. Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "And what does this have to do with our late bibliophile?" Wycherley handed over another document. A diary entry dated just 6 months before Mortimer Caulfield's death. "He came again last night, the man with my face. He did not speak, but he stood at the foot of the bed watching. I could feel him thinking at me. I know it is hallucination, but God forgive me, it is a convincing one. If a man believes in 2 selves, which one is guilty?" Whimsy read in silence. Then, Were there any signs of madness in Caulfield's later life? None recorded, Wycherley replied. Brilliant, eccentric, yes, but sane. Unless, of course, his mask was so perfect it deceived everyone, including himself. There was a long pause. Wimsey rose and walked to the window. Outside, Cambridge flowed past in scholarly indifference. Rowers on the Cam, bicycles ticking over cobblestones, a gull crying above King's College Chapel. I wonder, he said softly, how often oneself kills another, quietly, daily, not with poison or pistol, but by small betrayals, forgotten dreams, adopted voices. Wycherley frowned. You think Caulfield was at war with himself? Perhaps. Wimsey turned. Or perhaps someone else was winning the war without his noticing. They spoke a while longer, but nothing definitive emerged. Before leaving, Wimsey asked for a copy of the diary extract and took it home with him. That night, he lay in bed long past the hour of sleep, the fire burning low. Harriet stirred beside him and reached for his hand beneath the covers. "You're thinking again," she murmured. "Always," he said. Then after a pause, "Do you think we are who we believe ourselves to be?" She laughed quietly. "Number. But if we love each other honestly, perhaps that's enough." He kissed her forehead and closed his eyes. In the quiet, the strange margins of the mind began to fold back into silence. The last chapter of the Caulfield enigma was not a dramatic denouement, nor a thunderous revelation, but rather a quiet reckoning, the sort that seeps in slowly, like dusk, settling over a landscape long worn by shadow. Lord Peter Wimsey found himself once again in the manor house, this time under far less harrowing circumstances. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, the sunlight filtering through lace curtains casting delicate patterns on the faded carpets. Evangeline had returned for a brief visit before setting off to continue her studies abroad, and the house seemed less like a tomb and more like a sanctuary for memories that refused to fade. Wimsey stood by the fireplace in the study, examining the small violet pressed between the pages of the ancient folio he had discovered months before. The one Mortimer Caulfield had left behind like a cryptic signature. His gaze lingered on its fragile petals, and for a moment the distant echo of a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. The mystery, as it were, had concluded. Harold Quinn's guilty masquerade was unmasked, the layers of deceit, envy, and bitterness peeled away to reveal the human frailty beneath. Yet beyond the mere facts of murder there lay a more unsettling truth, that the self is a fragile construct, liable to fracture, to lose shape under the pressures of guilt, grief, and madness. Wimsey mused on the philosopher's riddle that had shadowed this case. The soul that smiles in silence, the face that does not recognize itself in the mirror. Evil, as he had learned once more, was rarely a flamboyant villain. It was often the quiet usurper, the borrowed mask, the shadow that grows in the neglected corners of the mind. As Evangeline joined him quietly, her eyes bright with a mixture of sadness and hope, Wimsey spoke softly. "Truth," he said, "is seldom a thing of clear lines and triumphant finales. It is a slow and patient thing, like the turning of a page you only half understand until the very end." She smiled, and the room seemed to breathe a little easier. Outside the day waned. The moor lay wrapped in mist, indifferent and eternal. Lord Peter Wimsey, for all his intellect and wit, knew that some mysteries were not meant to be fully solved. Some questions were better left whispered in the margins of books, in the silences between words, where the human heart still wrestled with its shadows. He took up his hat and cane, gave a slight bow to the past, and stepped into the evening light. The game was over, but the board remained,